The last time I knelt in the dirt, I was saving my family. I didn't know I was also meeting my king. My father was a foolish man who loved us well and protected us poorly. That is the most honest thing I can say about Darius. He believed in people who did not deserve belief. He shook hands with men whose smiles didn't reach their eyes and called it opportunity. And when Lord Sefton's representatives came to our door with loan documents printed in ink so fine you needed daylight to read the terms, my father signed because he thought he was saving us. He was building the cage we would eventually be sold from. I don't know exactly when he understood what he had done. I know it was before he disappeared, because the last time I saw him, his eyes carried the specific weight of a man who has counted the cost and found it unbearable. He kissed my forehead. He told me to take care of them. Then he walked out into a gray morning and did not come back. No body, no note, no explanation that could survive daylight. Sefton's collectors arrived 6 days later. They were efficient about it. Gord, the one who ran our case, had the practiced neutrality of a man who had stood in too many doorways exactly like ours and trained himself to feel nothing about any of them. He read the debt figure without inflection. He looked at Eli and Nadia the way a merchant looks at inventory, assessing value, calculating return. I spent 3 days trying to find another way. I borrowed against nothing. I appealed to neighbors who had nothing. I went to the district magistrate and watched his eyes slide away from mine before I finished my first sentence. The system consuming my family had been consuming families like mine for generations. Everyone knew, no one stopped it. That was simply the shape of the world. So, on the 4th day, I put on my cleanest dress and I went to Drove Market. The auction block sat in the center of the square, like something the city had grown around and stopped noticing. Midday sun. The smell of bodies and dust, and the particular sourness of fear held for too long. I pushed to the edge of the crowd and found them immediately. Eli on the left, jaw set in that way he had when he was terrified and furious in equal measure, hands fisted at his sides. Nadia beside him, leaning into his shoulder, her face tilted slightly down. My mother, who used to fill every room she entered, who used to sing while she cooked, reduced to standing on a block while strangers calculated her remaining usefulness. Something moved through me that I don't have a clean word for. Not rage, not grief. Something older and quieter than both. Gord called bids from the front. Numbers rose. Strangers raised their hands. Then a hand went up at the back. The man attached to it was large in a way that had nothing to do with comfort or wealth, built by use, shaped by something I couldn't name. Rough traveler's clothes, a scar along his jaw, pale against brown skin. His face was completely still, not cruel, not bored, simply closed, like a door with no handle on the outside. He raised his hand for Eli without any particular urgency, the way you raise your hand for something you have already decided on. My body made the decision before my mind did. I moved, through bodies that didn't want to yield, through noise and heat and the smell of that awful place, until I was standing in front of him, and then I wasn't standing at all. My knees hit the dirt. The square went quiet in the way crowds go quiet when something real is happening. I looked up at a face that gave me absolutely nothing, and I said the only words I had left. Take me instead. My voice didn't shake. I am still proud of that. I am stronger than my brother. I will work harder. I will last longer. I will not cause trouble, and I will not run. I kept my eyes on his, pale brown, unreadable, a locked room. Please, they are all I have left in this world. The market held its breath. He looked at me for a long time. I could not read him. I had spent my whole life learning to read people. It was the primary survival skill in a house where the temperature could change without warning, and this man was simply illegible. No pity, no amusement, no disgust, nothing I could hold. Then he looked at Gord. What is the full debt? Not a question, a calibration. Gord told him. The stranger reached into his coat and produced a payment envelope. That covers it. The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in confusion, which is always louder. Gord counted the envelope twice, then a third time. His expression moved through several things I didn't have the presence of mind to catalog. "The debt is settled," he said finally, in the voice of a man who had not expected to say those words today. "All three are released." All three. I stayed on my knees for a moment because my legs had stopped receiving instructions. He had paid all of it, not my price. All of it. Eli and Nadia were free. The word didn't fit inside my chest. It was too large. I had not let myself imagine it as a real outcome because wanting something that specific and not getting it would have finished me completely. I stood. My knees were bleeding where the stones had cut through my dress. I did not look down at them. I found Eli's face in the crowd. He had pushed to the front of the block. His expression, I cannot describe it. I don't have the language for what a 16-year-old boy looks like when he realizes his sister just traded her life for his. It is the kind of face that lives in your chest forever, the kind you carry. He called my name, just once. Karen, like a question, like a prayer, like he was begging me to take it back. The stranger spoke behind me, quiet and final, already moving. "You'll serve in the palace. Work hard, cause no trouble. Your family is free." No name, no explanation, no backward glance. He walked and expected me to follow, and I understood without being told that he would not ask twice. I looked at Eli one last time. This is what love costs, I thought. You pay it anyway. I turned away from my brother's voice and followed the stranger into the crowd. I did not let myself look back a second time. But I heard my mother speak as I walked away. Nadia, who had barely formed a full sentence in weeks, whose voice I had been afraid I was forgetting the sound of. She said, "That man is not what he looks like." I didn't understand it then. I didn't know that by the time I understood what she meant, it would already be too late to protect my heart. The palace did not overwhelm me with its beauty. I want to be clear about that. People assume. They hear palace and they imagine a girl from the lower district standing with her mouth open, undone by marble and gold. That is not what happened. What undid me was the rules, the invisible, unwritten, merciless rules that everyone around me seemed to have been born knowing, and no one was going to explain. Zara found me within an hour of my arrival. She was a small woman who moved like a sentence with no wasted words, direct, efficient, faintly contemptuous of anything that slowed her down. She looked me over once, the same way Gord had looked over Eli at the auction, and I felt the particular shame of being assessed and found adequate rather than worthy. She assigned me to the outer corridors, water hauling, laundry, the work that kept the palace functioning and remained entirely invisible to everyone the palace was actually for.
I did it without complaint, and I kept my eyes open.
I learned his name on the third day. It came in fragments. A title dropped carelessly in a corridor by a noble who didn't notice I was there. Then a name half-spoken by a servant who caught herself and went quiet. I assembled the pieces slowly. The way you assemble something you're not sure you want to finish building. Not a lord, not a rogue. Omar, the Alpha King. I stopped in the middle of a corridor with a bucket of water in each hand, and I stood very still, and I made myself hear it properly. I had knelt before the king, in the dirt, at a slave auction in the lower district. I had pressed my knees into the stones of Drav Market and begged the Alpha King to purchase me instead of my brother. I found Sepha, a girl who had been in the palace 3 years and had the careful eyes of someone who had survived it by paying attention. I asked her quietly if it was true. She looked at me with the expression of someone deciding how much honesty a person can absorb at once. "Yes," she said. Then, "Don't say it out loud again." She walked away before I could ask what she meant. I saw him that afternoon for the first time as what he actually was. He came through the East Corridor with 4 advisors moving in his orbit like planets that had forgotten they had their own gravity. The ceremonial robes, the weight of authority he wore the way other men wear skin, not as something put on, but as something grown into over years of having no alternative. He was speaking to the man on his left in a low voice, not raising it, not needing to. Every person in the corridor made room without being asked. He did not look at me. I was a girl with a water bucket pressed against the wall, and he was the Alpha King, and he did not look at me. And I told myself this was correct. I told myself this was exactly right. This changed nothing about my situation. I told myself that for the rest of the afternoon. I didn't believe it for a single moment. Lady Soraya appeared near the end of my first week. She moved through the palace the way water moves through channels it has carved over years, not forcing anything, simply following paths she had made herself. Beautiful in the way of someone who had cultivated it deliberately, over time, as a strategic asset. She came around a corner and I was there with my mop, and she looked at me. Once. 2 seconds at most. Then she moved on without breaking stride, without speaking, without any expression I could name. The temperature in the corridor dropped 4 degrees. I am not speaking figuratively. I was still thinking about that look an hour later, when I became aware of someone else watching me. Different quality entirely. I turned and found a man at the far end of the corridor. Sharp-faced, still, watching me with an expression I could not decode. Not hostile, not welcoming. Something more careful than either, like a man withholding conclusions until he has more information than anyone else in the room. He held my gaze for a moment, then he walked away without speaking. I did not know his name yet. I filed him in the part of my mind reserved for things I didn't understand, but needed to urgently. That night I knelt on the marble floor of the outer corridor, scrubbing stone that was already clean, because Zara's standard was not cleanliness, but submission. And I thought, I gave myself to the most powerful man in the kingdom, and he doesn't know my name. Then I heard it. 2 servants at the far end of the corridor, speaking in the low, rapid tone of people sharing something they shouldn't.
I kept scrubbing. I kept my breathing even. I listened. One name surfaced from the whisper, clear and unmistakable. Mine, followed immediately by a second name that made my hands stop moving entirely. Sefton. Not idle gossip, not curiosity, the specific deliberateness of people who have been given information and are deciding what to do with it. Someone had connected my name to his already. Someone had gone into my file and pulled the thread and handed it to whoever was standing at the end of that corridor. I pressed my cloth against the marble and thought, I have been in this palace less than a week, and someone has already begun building something with my name in it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I thought about the one person in this palace who had looked at me with the eyes of someone conducting an assessment. Soraya. And I thought, whatever she is building, she has not finished yet.
Nobody watches a maid. That is the first useful thing I learned about my position. Not its indignity, not its exhaustion, but its strategic value. I was invisible to everyone who mattered, and present in every room that mattered, and those two facts together made me something no noble advisor could ever be, a witness with no reputation to protect. So I watched Omar the way you watch weather, not because you can change it, but because understanding it is the difference between survival and being caught in something you didn't see coming. I watched the muscle in his jaw tighten when reports contradicted what he'd been told the week before. I watched him cut advisors off mid-sentence with the quiet efficiency of a man who had already calculated where the sentence was going. I watched him stand at the tall window off the main hall for long minutes, completely still, staring at nothing. That last one told me the most. Stillness that complete means the opposite of empty. It means full to the point of pressure, thoughts running so fast and so deep that the body has been left behind entirely. He was exhausted. He was carrying something enormous, and he was doing it entirely alone, in a building that contained hundreds of people. I recognized this feeling with my whole body. It was the linen closet on the third floor that undid the careful distance I had been maintaining. Late, past the hour when the inner palace usually quieted, I came around the corner at the end of the corridor, moving too fast, because I thought it was empty. It was not empty. The collisions scattered linens across 6 feet of marble floor. In the first confused second, I was already forming apologies, and then I looked up. He was already crouching, not commanding a servant to retrieve them, crouching, reaching for the nearest folded sheet with the automatic instinct of someone who was going to help before he remembered he wasn't supposed to. He stopped with his hand on the linen. We were both on the floor, equally surprised, equally unsure what the next moment was supposed to look like. The corridor was very quiet. He looked at me, not through me, not past me, at me, with the full attention of someone who had briefly forgotten to perform anything. He said, "What is your name?" I said, "Karen." Something moved behind his eyes, a door opening a fraction, and then going still. I watched him place me, watched the recognition travel across his face, and then get very carefully controlled. The auction, the dirt, the 3 words. He knew exactly who I was. He did not say so. I did not say so. We both stood. He set the linen on top of my stack. He walked away without looking back.
The entire exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. I thought about it for the rest of the week.
What I did not know, until Sepha mentioned it carefully 3 days later, was that we had not been alone in that corridor. Roshan had been at the far end, watching, silent. I added it to the growing list of things in this palace I did not understand, but needed to, urgently. The warning from Zara came on a Tuesday. She called me into her office and read from a formal document without looking up. It had been reported to the palace comptroller that I had been forwarding a portion of my servant's wage to parties outside the palace, specifically to family members connected to an outstanding debt with Lord Sefton's estate. This constituted an unauthorized external disbursement. I was formally warned. A second infraction would result in contract review. She set the document down and looked at me with something that was almost sympathy and would not quite become it. "Do you understand?" she said. "Yes," I said. I understood completely. Not the statute, the move. Soraya had found my wage records, had researched the relevant statutes, had filed a formal report through the comptroller's office, not confronting me directly, not making a scene, not doing any of the obvious things. She had used the institution itself as a weapon and aimed it at me with paperwork. I was not dealing with a jealous woman. I was dealing with a politician. I passed her in the corridor an hour after Zara's warning. She was speaking to 2 noble ladies, women whose names I didn't know yet, whose silk and jewels marked them as people whose opinions carried social weight in this palace. Soraya was mid-sentence when I came around the corner with my laundry cart, and she did something I did not expect. She stopped speaking and looked at me directly, in front of both women, with the particular patience of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment. "This," she said to the ladies beside her, in the pleasant tone of someone explaining something mildly interesting, "is the girl from the slave auction." The 2 women turned, looked at me the way you look at something that has appeared in a room where it doesn't belong, with the faint distaste of people who have never had to consider that they might one day stand where I was standing. "Drav market," Soraya continued, as though narrating a mildly curious exhibit. "Lord Sefton's debt. The family couldn't pay." A brief pause. "It's always the same story, isn't it?" She returned to her conversation without waiting for a response, as though I had already ceased to be interesting. I stood with my laundry cart in the corridor, and I did not move until they had rounded the corner. Then I stood a moment longer. She had not raised her voice. She had not insulted me directly. She had done something more precise and more damaging. She had given me a category, the girl from the slave auction, a label that would travel through this palace faster than anything I could say or do, attaching itself to my name before I had the chance to make one. She didn't do that because she hates me, I thought. She did it because she can. That is so much worse. That evening, I sat on the edge of my cot and I counted my vulnerabilities carefully. The comptroller's record, the Sefton connection, the corridor moment Roshan had witnessed, the label Soraya had just attached to my name in front of witnesses who would carry it, and the fact that I had no allies here, no history, no armor of any kind. But it was what came after that, the cold thought that arrived quietly and would not leave, that kept me awake. If Soraya had investigated my wage records within days of my arrival, she had access to everything.
She had been in this palace for a decade. She had connections in every administrative office. The question was not what she knew, it was what she was waiting for before she used it, and why, with all the weapons she already had available, she had chosen to fire only small ones so far. I thought about that for a long time in the dark. Small strikes, documented, building a record. She wasn't trying to remove me yet. She was constructing a foundation for something larger, something she intended to be unanswerable when the time came. Zara delivered the news the way she delivered everything, directly, without decoration, watching my face for a reaction she would not comment on regardless of what she saw. I was being moved to the inner palace, effective immediately. She did not say why. I did not ask. We both understood that the why was not something either of us was supposed to examine out loud. What I could not move was the attention that followed me there in the eyes of servants who tracked my new assignment with careful interest, in the stiffened posture of nobles I passed who had not previously registered my existence. I had been invisible for weeks. Invisibility, I was discovering, is a condition that can be revoked without your consent. Soraya said nothing. That silence was louder than anything she could have spoken. Working in the inner palace meant proximity to Omar with texture I hadn't had before. I learned the rhythm of his days. I learned which hours the careful armor slipped by degrees. I learned that he noticed things other people missed. I learned on the 5th day that he was wrong about the East Antechamber supply rotation. He issued the instruction to Zara in my presence, and I stood with a stack of linen and thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "That won't work," I said. The room went very still. Zara's expression performed the specific blankness of a woman who has decided she is not present for whatever is about to happen. Omar turned and looked at me with the full weight of his attention, which was not a comfortable thing to be under. "Explain," he said. So I did. The rotation he had described would create a 3-day gap in the supply chain because of how the delivery schedule intersected with the cleaning cycle. I had been watching it for 2 weeks. The math was straightforward once you had the full picture, which nobody had given him. He listened without expression. Then he turned back to Zara and issued a modified instruction that resolved the gap entirely. He did not say I was right. He simply adjusted and moved on. And I understood that this was the form his acknowledgement took. Not words, but action. It happened again 2 days later, and again after that. It became a pattern neither of us named. The argument about the working hours was different. That one had edges. He issued a directive that would extend the inner staff's evening duties by 2 hours across the board, and I heard it and thought about Seifa, already running on 4 hours of sleep, hands starting to shake by end of shift, and something in me that was not interested in being careful said, "That will break people." He turned, slowly. "I beg your pardon?" "The evening extension. The inner staff is already at capacity. 2 additional hours won't increase the work that gets done. It will increase the number of people too exhausted to do it correctly. You'll see more errors, not fewer." A silence that had weight in it. "And how would you handle it?" Not dismissal, a genuine question. So I told him. Redistribute the load laterally across shifts. Bring in 2 additional evening staff from the outer rotation 3 days a week. same coverage, sustainable hours, lower error rate within a fortnight. He looked at me for a long moment. Leave the specifics with Zara. The conversation had run 20 minutes longer than either of us intended. When I finally became aware of the changed light in the corridor, we both noticed simultaneously. Something shifted in the air between us. Not warmth, the specific recognition of two people who have discovered their minds move in compatible directions, which is its own kind of dangerous intimacy, because it is harder to dismiss than attraction, and harder to defend against than beauty. Neither of us acknowledged it. He left. I went to find Zara.
Roshan fell into step beside me in the corridor afterward, brief, as though accidental. He said nothing consequential, but his presence had shifted, less like assessment, more like something arriving at a provisional conclusion. He peeled away at the corridor junction without another word. I went back to my room, and I sat on the edge of my cot, and I looked directly at the thing I had been refusing to name. This is dangerous, I thought. I know exactly what this is. I need to stop. I did not stop. 3 days later, Soraya found me alone. I was restocking the East Wing reading room, a task that required no supervision and generated no witnesses, when I heard her enter behind me. I did not turn immediately. I finished placing the volume I was holding, because I had learned in this palace that the person who reacts first reveals the most. Then I turned. She stood near the doorway with the ease of someone who had positioned herself to block the exit without appearing to have done so. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of a woman who has decided to do someone a courtesy by being direct. "I want to say something to you," she said, "that I think you will appreciate more than the alternative." I waited. "You are not the first girl this has happened with," she said pleasantly. "A new face, a briefly interesting story. He is a king who travels in disguise because he is bored with the palace, not because he is looking for something real." She tilted her head slightly. "Whatever you think is developing between you and Omar, and I can see that you think something is, I want you to understand that it has a ceiling, and that ceiling is considerably lower than you are currently imagining." She paused, letting that settle. "The difference between you and the others," she continued, "is that the others understood when to step back gracefully. They left with their dignity and their contracts intact." Another pause. "I am telling you this now, while both of those things are still available to you." She smiled, not warmly, but with the precision of someone who has just made an offer they expect to be accepted. Then she left. I stood in the reading room for a long time after she was gone. She had not threatened me this time. She had offered me an exit, graceful, dignified, framed as a kindness, which meant she was more concerned than she was letting on, which meant she had seen something between Omar and me that I hadn't fully allowed myself to see yet. I sat with that for a long time, and I thought, she just told me everything I needed to know. She told me it's real enough to frighten her, and she is not a woman who frightens easily. The library was not the place I was supposed to be. Zara had not forbidden it explicitly. She was too precise for unnecessary prohibitions. But I knew. The palace library was for scholars, advisors, nobles with leisure and the entitlement that comes from never having had to haul water. It was not for maids from the lower district who showed up in comptroller records as administrative infractions. I went anyway. Nadia's illness had shifted.
Eli's letter described symptoms the local physician couldn't place, a specific kind of fever that came and went on a cycle, and I had been carrying the description like a stone in my chest for days. If the palace library had remedy texts, and it did, then the question of whether I was supposed to be there was smaller than the question of whether my mother was going to be all right. Zara had looked the other way when I slipped out after my evening duties. She had simply not been in the corridor she was usually in, which amounted to the same thing.
The library was vast and dim, and smelled of old paper and the particular quiet of a room that takes its purpose seriously. I found the medical text section after 20 minutes of searching in entirely the wrong direction. The organizational logic was not intuitive to someone who had learned to read from a single shelf of books in a house with a leaking roof. And I began working through spines in the low lamplight, increasingly frustrated. I did not hear him come in. I became aware of him the way you become aware of a change in air pressure, not a sound exactly, but a shift in the quality of the room that told me I was no longer alone. I turned. Omar stood near the entrance, without advisors or ceremony, watching me work through the shelf with an expression I had gotten slightly better at reading. Not blank, but contained, processing something he hadn't yet decided what to do with. I should have excused myself. Every sensible instinct pointed in that direction. I didn't move. Neither did he for a moment. Then he crossed the room, not toward me, but past me, to a different section entirely, to a shelf on the far wall I wouldn't have found before morning. He pulled a volume. He crossed back and set it on the table in front of me without a word. Fever patterns in complex illness, cyclical presentation and treatment. He knew. He had known exactly why I was there, and instead of questioning my presence, he had walked to the correct shelf and put the answer in front of me like it was nothing. No performance, no expectation of gratitude, no acknowledgement that anything unusual was happening at all. He left before I could form a single word. I sat down at the library table, and I pressed my hands flat against the wood, and I felt the wall I had been maintaining develop a crack I didn't know how to repair. They came for me on a Thursday morning. 2 palace officials and Gord, Lord Sefton's debt collector, the man with the dead eyes from Drove Market, standing in the palace corridor in his good coat like he had every right to be there. And they used words like formal inquiry and council review and evidence of misconduct in the specific sequence that means you do not have a choice about what happens next. The council chamber was smaller than I expected, and colder. The nobles seated along the table had the expressions of people who have already reached their conclusion and are present for the formality of appearing not to have done so. Soraya sat to the side, not at the table, which would have been too visible, but in the peripheral position of someone who has arranged everything and can afford to watch from a comfortable distance. She looked the way a well-made clock looks when all its components are moving exactly as designed. They laid out the evidence with the efficient pleasure of people who had prepared it carefully. A letter, supposedly in my hand, addressed to an intermediary connected to Sefton's network, palace information, staff schedules, movement patterns, a stolen administrative seal, the wage forwarding incident as character foundation. Look at the pattern, they said, without quite saying it. Look at how she has always been moving resources outward. It was elegant.
She had taken my real circumstances, the debt, the family, the Sefton connection I had never escaped, and she had built a lie around the true parts so that the true parts would make the lie believable.
I knelt when protocol required it, and I presented my defense the only way I knew how, plainly, directly, without tears, the same way I had spoken in the dirt at the auction. I told the truth. I did not beg. The council was not moved by plainness. I could see it in the way they listened, with the polite attentiveness of people performing a required motion before arriving at a decision they had already made. Soraya watched with the composed satisfaction of someone watching their own careful work perform correctly. The doors opened. He came in without announcement, the room recalibrated around him the way rooms always did. He took the evidence documents and he read them, all of them. The room waited. Then he looked up. He looked at me. "Did you do this?" he said. I looked back at him, not at the king, not at the authority in the room, but at the man who had walked to a library shelf in the dark and put a book on a table without asking for anything in return. And I said, "No." One word. He held my gaze for a moment, then he turned to the council. "The evidence is insufficient. I am ordering a full investigation before any judgment is rendered. This proceeding is suspended." The council erupted with the concentrated outrage of men who had arranged something carefully and watched it dismantled in 30 seconds. Soraya's composure slipped. A fraction, a tightening around the eyes, one moment where the clock showed its mechanism. She recovered immediately, but I had seen it. The chamber emptied slowly. Roshan appeared beside me as the last council member left. "He put himself in front of the council for you," he said. "You should understand what that costs a king." He walked away before I could respond. That night I sat on the edge of my cot with my hands pressed to my face, and I stayed very still. He believed me, I thought. Of everything in this palace, the library, the corridor, every exchange we have had, that is the one thing I cannot explain away. The lamp burned low. I sat in the dimming light, and I finally understood how much danger I was in. Not from Soraya, not from the council, from the feeling I had stopped pretending wasn't there. Because the next morning I woke to Sepha's voice outside my door, stripped of its usual careful calm. "Karen, they arrested Zara. They're saying she helped you access the library. They're pulling her employment records. They're going after everyone connected to you." I sat up in the dark. Soraya wasn't recalculating. She was expanding. She had heard Roshan's words somehow, or she had simply anticipated them, and she had understood that the council hearing had not broken me. So she had changed targets. She was pulling at threads connected to me, unraveling the small network of quiet decencies that had allowed me to survive in this place. And she was doing it methodically, one person at a time, until I was completely alone. I got dressed in the dark, and I thought about Zara. 30 years of palace service, precise and honest, and guilty of nothing except not being in a corridor she was usually in on one particular evening. I had done that, and Soraya knew exactly how that would feel. The palace had been holding its breath for 5 days. Zara was suspended pending investigation. 3 noble houses had formally aligned against Omar's independent governance. The petition, suspended after the council hearing, had gone underground, gathering signatures in private, waiting for the right moment to resurface with enough weight to be unanswerable. I carried all of this, and I went to work, and I kept my eyes open, and I waited, because there was nothing else I could do. It was on the 5th evening that I took a wrong turn, genuinely wrong, a new corridor I hadn't mapped, and found a door that opened onto a terrace I didn't know existed. I almost went back. Then I saw him. He was standing at the stone railing in plain clothes, a simple dark tunic worn at the cuffs. No advisors, no orbit of people needing things from him. Just a man standing in the night air above a sleeping kingdom with the posture of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has come here to set it down briefly where no one can watch. I must have made a sound. He said, without turning, "You can go if you want." Not a command, not an invitation. The choice was mine. I stayed. We stood several feet apart and looked out at the same dark kingdom, and neither of us spoke for a while. It was the first time since arriving in this palace that I had been in the same space as another person without performing anything. No role, no carefulness. Just two people existing in the same air. He asked me something neutral, about the East Wing, about a supply issue he'd heard about third hand. I answered. We talked about the palace the way two people talk about work, when work is the only safe common ground they have. It was not warm. It was not nothing. Then he said, "You know why I was in that market?" "Yes," I said. "And you know why I travel without the crown. You want to see the kingdom as it actually is, not the version your advisors prepare for you." A pause. What version did you know? I looked at the thin, scattered lights of the lower district in the far distance. I lived in the part of your kingdom, I said, that your advisors describe as stable. He was quiet. Tell me what it actually looks like. So I told him, not with anger, just with the precision of someone who had lived it and remembered it clearly. The way debt moved through families like a disease, the way the magistrates' offices were technically open and practically inaccessible, the way Gord had stood in our doorway with his dead eyes and his good coat, because he had stood in too many doorways to feel any of them anymore. Omar listened. He did not interrupt. He did not manage what I was saying into something more comfortable. He simply received it. And the quality of his attention, focused, undefended, was so different from every interaction I had watched him perform in this palace that I had to remind myself to keep speaking. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your family, how are they?" "Eli wants to be a scholar. He has been borrowing books from the district lending house since he was 9. "And your mother?" "Improving. The remedy text helped. Her physician says another month and she should be able to manage the stairs again." "You still send them money," he said, "even with the comptroller's warning." "I found a compliant method within the statutes." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, something that had been in the direction of one before it thought better of itself. "Even from here," he said quietly, something like recognition. "Always," I said. He looked at the kingdom. Then, "Your brother is fortunate." I should have left it there.
But I was tired. 5 days of held breath and suspended Zara, and the weight of knowing his enemies were building something I couldn't fully see. And something in me that was done being careful said it before I could stop it. I hope you have someone who does the same for you, someone who takes care of you the way I take care of them. He opened his mouth. I watched him begin to form the response he always gave, the managed deflection, the answer shaped to satisfy without revealing. I had seen it enough times to recognize its beginning. He stopped. I watched him stop, watched him hear himself about to perform and choose not to. The silence lasted several seconds. Then he said, "I don't. I haven't let anyone." Not with sorrow, not asking for anything, simply a fact, said with the flatness of someone saying something true for the first time after saying something managed for so long that truth has a different texture. He looked almost surprised at himself. I went completely still.
I understood what I had just witnessed. The precise moment a man who had governed everything except his own interior life looked directly at it and didn't look away. It was small. It was enormous. So I stood in the silence after it, and I let myself ask the question I had been circling for weeks, plainly, the way I asked myself everything when I finally allowed it. Is this real? Or is this what happens to a person with no power who spends enough time near someone who has all of it? I held both possibilities. I examined them honestly. I thought about the working hours argument, how I had pushed back, not because I needed to survive that conversation, but because I genuinely thought he was wrong, and I couldn't help myself. I thought about the library, how I had felt before he came in, entirely independent of him, focused on Nadia's fever chart and frustrated at the medical texts section. I thought about saying no in the council chamber with one word and meaning it completely. A person shaped entirely by captivity doesn't argue, doesn't push back, doesn't think their own thoughts in rooms occupied by their captor, doesn't feel the specific friction of genuine disagreement, which is different from fear, and I knew the texture of fear well enough to tell them apart. What I felt for Omar had not grown from powerlessness. It had grown despite every condition that should have killed it before it started. It was real. The certainty arrived quietly, the way real things do. Complete, entirely mine. He reached for my hand. I pulled back, not dramatically, a small, visible withdrawal. He registered it immediately. He did not push. He held his hand in the space between us and waited. I sat with it for a long moment. Then I reached out and took his hand myself. Not received, chosen. The distinction mattered more than I had words for, that I was not taken, not swept, not overcome by circumstances larger than myself. I was a person making a deliberate act with full knowledge of what it meant. We sat in the dark above the sleeping kingdom, and neither of us spoke, and his hand was warm, and the night air was cold, and I was, for the first time since kneeling in the dirt at Drove Market, entirely certain about something I was doing only for myself. Eventually I stood. He didn't try to keep me. I walked back through the dark corridors, and halfway there, I stopped. I pressed my palm flat against the cold stone wall, the warmth of his hand against the cold of the stone.
I know what this is now, I thought. I'm not afraid of knowing. Then I heard voices around the corner, two of them, low and deliberate. Roshan, and another man, older, precise, reciting rather than conversing. Specific words surfaced through the stone. The girl. A pause. Before the full council. Another pause. No room for the king to intervene this time. I stood with my palm against the wall, and my hand still warm, and the cold reaching up through the stone. And I understood that Soraya had not been recalculating. She had been finishing. And this time, she had made certain Omar would not be able to stop it.
Roshan came before dawn. Not a knock, a presence outside my door, the particular stillness of someone who has been standing there long enough to decide something. I was already awake. I had not slept since the corridor. I opened the door. He stood in the unlit passage with his customary expression, but something underneath it had shifted. He looked like a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely at peace with and had made it anyway because it was correct. He spoke without preamble. The noble council was moving at first light, a formal petition, not the suspended one, a new one, broader, with signatures from 11 houses, built around a single argument, that the king's judgment had been compromised by personal attachment to a palace servant, and that independent rule under those conditions constituted a governance risk the kingdom could not absorb. The petition named me specifically. It used the council hearing, the evidence proceeding, Omar's intervention, all of it documented, all of it framed as a pattern rather than an incident. Without me in the palace, the petition lost its living evidence. If I left tonight before first light, before the petition was formally filed, the case weakened significantly. Possibly fatally. He stopped speaking. He did not tell me what to do. He gave me the information and waited, and I understood that this was what every interaction since his first unreadable look in the corridor had been building toward. Not testing my loyalty, not assessing my threat level, but determining whether I was the kind of person who could receive the full weight of a real decision and carry it without being told how. "I'll come to you before 6th bell," he said, "whatever you decide." He left. I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of my cot in the dark, and I let myself feel the full size of it. I could go. I turned it over carefully, without flinching, without rushing toward the conclusion that felt better. I could leave before the palace woke. I could walk back through the lower district, back to the street where Eli was probably already awake, reading something borrowed, back to the house where Nadia was managing the stairs again. I could be free. I sat with that possibility, and I gave it the full respect of genuine consideration. Then I thought about Drav Market. I thought about a stranger who looked at me kneeling in the dirt and paid more than I asked and asked for nothing in return, who walked away without waiting for gratitude because he hadn't done it for gratitude. I thought about a book on a library table, a cloth left beside broken glass, a hand held in the dark above a sleeping kingdom, held, not taken, because even then he understood the difference. I thought about what I had understood on that terrace, what I had examined honestly and found to be true, what I had chosen to take in my own hand rather than receive. It was real,
I had already answered that question. The answer did not change because the situation had become dangerous. If anything, the danger clarified it. I thought, Soraya is going to use what is true about me to destroy what is true about him, and I am not going to let her. Not with anger, with the same quiet certainty I had in the dirt at the auction. I did not go back to sleep. At fifth bell, I dressed carefully. Not in my maid's clothes, in the dress I had worn to Drav Market. It was not silk, it was not armor, it was simply mine, and I put it on, and I walked through the palace corridors in the gray pre-dawn light, and I went to the council chamber. I arrived before anyone. I stood in the center of the cold room, and I looked at the petition already laid out on the table, my name appearing 7 times on the first page alone, and I breathed. Then the council members began to arrive. They came in ones and twos, carrying the composed certainty of people who had arranged something and arrived to watch it conclude. They saw me and stopped. The first one actually stepped backward. The second looked toward the door. The third, the one who had been transcribing a predetermined conclusion at the last hearing, looked at me with an expression that moved through surprise into something that might have been, briefly, respect. I did not wait for them to sit. I spoke. I told them about the wage forwarding complaint first, pulled the comptroller's statutes from memory, the specific threshold Soraya had misrepresented, the actual amount I had forwarded against the actual permitted limit. The misrepresentation was not ambiguous. It was deliberate and demonstrable, and I demonstrated it. Then I told them about the letter. The seal had been receipted by Zara 3 days after the date on the forged letter. A letter cannot be stamped with a seal that does not yet exist in the building. This was not interpretation. It was arithmetic. I watched several council members look at each other with the careful expressions of people recalculating. Then I looked at each of them in turn, slowly, without rush. You can remove a king for falling in love, I said. You cannot remove him for being right, and he was right about me. The room went very quiet. The evidence had given them permission to change their minds. That sentence gave them the reason. Soraya came in at the far door. She had miscalculated the timing, expected to arrive to a proceeding already in motion, not to this. She looked at me, and at the council, and at the quality of the silence, and I watched her make the assessment in real time. Her face performed composure. Everything underneath it was moving fast.
She spoke. That was her mistake. She had spent 30 years never making a move she hadn't prepared for, and she tried to prepare for this one in real time. And what came out was too precise, too structured, too cold and too deliberate in a room that had just been moved by the opposite of all those things. The council heard the mechanism that my plainness had already made audible, and one by one I watched them stop listening to what she was saying and start listening to how. 30 years of careful positioning, 30 seconds of exposure. The petition deflated, not with a crash, but with a slow, irreversible settling. I watched it happen in the postures of the men around the table, in the way the note-taker quietly closed his document. The doors opened. Omar came in with the focused attention of a man who had received information mid-corridor and arrived somewhere he did not expect to find what he found. He took in the room, the council, the collapsed petition, Soraya's failed composure, and me, standing in the center of it in my market dress with my hands at my sides. He went still for a moment. Then he crossed the room. Not quickly, deliberately, with the full, unhurried weight of a man who has decided something and is done pretending otherwise. He crossed in front of every council member, every advisor, every witness the chamber contained, and he took my hand. No explanation, no performance, no management of how it appeared. He simply refused to pretend anymore. At the edge of the room, Roshan bowed his head. Not to the king, to me.
The contract dissolution was formal and public. Omar read the language himself in front of the council, leaving no clause that could be reinterpreted. I was no longer bound. I was free. He waited until the document was witnessed and sealed. Then he looked at me with the particular quality of someone who has extended themselves fully and is still not certain the answer will hold because some things are too important to assume. "Stay," he said. "Not for this palace, not for the crown. Stay because you want to." I looked at him, at the man who had crouched on a floor to help me gather scattered linens, who had walked to a library shelf in the dark, who had stood in front of a council and said the evidence is insufficient, knowing exactly what it would cost him, who had sat on a terrace in plain clothes and said, I haven't let anyone, with the surprised expression of someone hearing themselves tell the truth for the first time. I thought of the auction, of my knees in the dirt, of the 3 words I had said without flinching because there was no alternative I could live inside. I had made that choice for my family. I was making this one for myself. They felt, I realized, exactly the same. "Yes," I said. The courtyard ceremony was not what I had imagined ceremonies to be, not in its scale, which was considerable, but in how it felt to stand inside it. I knelt on clean stone in borrowed silk, and the morning light was clear, and I was not afraid. I was not performing. I was not surviving. I was choosing. Omar lifted me up. His hands were steady and certain, and I rose from the stone and stood, and I thought, this is the correct direction. Not the kneeling, the rising. This is what all of it was for. The last time I knelt in the dirt, I was saving my family. This time, I was choosing myself. I didn't know at the beginning that those were always the same thing.